mean, I'm not the right demographic for that. It's a very, it's much more of a cultural sort of indigenous thinking kind of an idea. But I think the biggest sort of conversation and the Afrofuturism thing is that there's a lot of conversation in our industry around more indigenous futures or getting non sort of weird Western perspectives into thinking about the future. Because we can come up with new ideas there rather than the same old ideas. If we're not capable of dreaming up new things, then other groups should do it. And the Afrofuturism one is more de facto interesting, just that Africa is going to be the biggest population continent in quite foreseeable future there.
Attention, all citizens of the future. Buckle up and step into our time tunnel of imagination to join us on an extraordinary journey into the days of futures past. Remember those flying cars and space rockets, the robot maids and cities on Mars that dazzled your childhood dreams of life beyond? This, my friends, is where our adventure begins. So let's go to our guide, that excavator of the eventual, that historian of the hereafter, that recorder of retro futures, Theo Priestley.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Days of Futures Past, where I talk with a guest about retrofuture, what the past visions of the future were that they were excited them and inspired them as children, and where we are today, whether we've lost those futures or whether we're hitting the mark with them. Today's guest is Bronwyn Williams, who is a futurist, economist, strategist, trend analyst, an avid reader and an author as well, who also helped me co-author my book as well, The Future Starts Now. Bronwyn, how are you? Yeah.
Thanks for yourself, yours.
Yeah, not too bad. So what's keeping you busy these days?
Oh, all sorts of things. Mainly, I spend most of my time running my little consultancy in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is a great place to be if you want front row seats to, Armageddon, general chaos, right? I mean, like we're always in the middle of it, aren't we? We have outsized influence compared to our actual impact in the world, which is always an interesting place to be. But we consult to businesses and also increasingly to government institutions around how to understand the world and then how to change it to their ends, whether those ends be more positive or more nefarious, right? That's the role of us court jesters or contemporary prophets, right? We're talking heads that get paid quite nicely to, plant ideas in interesting places in the world.
Yeah, well, you and I seem to have a similar view of the world, and especially I wrote a piece on the State of Futurism in general, and the lack of, I would say, visionary optimism, or unconstrained visionary optimism that the world seems to lack today. I mean, do you see that amongst your peers on LinkedIn and in consultancies as well?
Well, funny you said that. If you just buy our book, we'll explain that point in great detail. But there's essentially two traps that anyone thinking about the future falls into. The one is blatant accelerationism, which is distinct from what you're talking about, visionary futurism. But it's this idea of like technological progress at all costs, doesn't matter who you sort of stampede on or what you move fast and break things in order to get your version of the future onto the table. Nothing could go wrong because it is, of course, my vision. And of course, we've spent a good long time both in the industry and out the industry, mocking people who do have such linear views or myopic views of the future that just sort of suits their own ends to the T. But there's the other sort, the sort of sad sack, generally academic lot that just spend a lot of time complaining and shooting down absolutely anyone's ideas about anything because, we're all made of carbon and carbon is bad, right? So really any idea that comes out of a human brain is tainted just by existing, and therefore we should go back to some imaginary time when things were better, or at best case just sort of freeze everything as it is now so it doesn't get worse. And that's hardly interesting, exciting, and certainly not a great way to get paid either. But that's the sort of state of futurism. Either sort of ridiculous optimism and Andresian-like complete disregard for any sort of suffering involved in meeting your end, or on the other hand, just a complete disregard for any suffering that will result from not doing anything. I mean, there's so much stuff we should be changing. There's so many clear problems around us that obviously we need to grow and develop and change. And to do that, we need new ideas, but we also don't need just singular ideas. And I think that's the difference in ethos between someone like yourself and myself, who criticize most of our field for having no optimism about the future whatsoever, and no sort of nothing nice to say about any new toy or any new idea. And on the other hand, also not falling into the trap of trying to sort of shoehorn your versions and your ideas across other people. I think that that's what something else that you and I have in common, this idea that the future should be have more voices and more votes in it, right? More good ideas and bad ideas. We hopefully don't execute on too many of the bad ones, but we have to have more of them in the ring in order to have any sort of map as to where we're headed. Can we blame the sort of tech titans for building bad ideas if we haven't scribbled any new ones on the sort of blank page of the future ahead? Not really. They clearly lack imagination, and they're looking to us, futurist science fiction writers, for new ideas, and we haven't come up with any new ones since what, like the 1920s, right? And I'm sure you're going to speak about that a lot on the show with many of your guests. That most of the most futuristic things today are actually very old ideas from very long ago, from long dead and buried people. Where are the new ideas? What have we come up with? And certainly, what have we come up with in the ideas space? Because the world of industry is coming up with lots of ways to, extract more capital and redistribute more wealth, and they do it all the time. But they're not particularly imaginative, and not necessarily sort of step change in a good way for humanity going ahead.
Yeah, I kind of echo that, and the idea that not only is it like shooting down ideas or being critical about everything else, but it's the notion that people are scared to convey their ideas now because they get shot down, and so therefore we don't hear anything new. And you're in this sort of endless cycle here. And all the people with really good ideas that are not incremental, because this is what the tech industry is now caught in as well, which is, incrementalism, which is, we'll just improve this little product just one bit so we can extract, like you say, your 10x value back for the investors. But the idea or the big world-changing ideas are coming from introverts who don't want to speak about it because they're scared. They're scared of being shot down.
Whoa.
Now you come from South Africa, or certainly you're based in South Africa just now in Johannesburg. I mean, what's the sentiment over there in terms of the future, and certainly growing up there as well? I mean, it must have been very different from the West, and to some degree, the East as well.
Well, yes and no. I mean, South Africa is part of the weird Western world, both like culturally and even sort of spiritually, whatever you want to look at. We're very much a sort of a product and a sort of a bad copy paste of basically like a hybrid of American and British culture. And I say that across most of our racial and ethnic groups in this country. And that's just simply because we grew up with that sort of television. We weren't making many ideas of our own. And certainly if you didn't speak Afrikaans, the sort of language of the terrible apartheid government, the only things you got to look at or listen to, or only media you got to consume, was imported. And that goes for pretty much any language group other than the very small minority of the then ruling party of the very niche Afrikaans sort of demographic. So our ideas are saturated in Western ideology, Western academia, Western ways of being educated, Western language even. I mean, the language of business is still English. And I think that the language does sort of shape thoughts and phraseology and the way we sort of communicate quite a lot too. But it has always been an interesting place in that, although it is kind of modeled poorly off the West and certainly aspires to Western ideals and consumerism, certainly at the moment, however much we want to resist that or pretend that we're not, we also are rather cut off from the rest of the world. We have quite a far plane ride away from any of the communities that we sort of badly emulated or want to critique at the same time. And of course, you generally want to critique your own sort of fathers and families of ideas, which I think is also an interesting point to note. But we kind of are on the edge, sort of an edge of the sort of frontier, if you want to put it that way, which means that quite often bad and good ideas can be trialed out here as a sort of preview as to how these ideas will play out in larger markets going forward. So the sort of edge of chaos, the bleeding edge of how ideas in theory turn into ideas in practice, which is something we've done a lot in South Africa. We've taken ideas and ideologies and academic thoughts, and we just sort of applied them. We just applied them. We just wrote that constitution that way. We just applied that policy. We try it out yet, not necessarily thinking about how it's going to turn out. And we can be seen as a bit of a laboratory for seeing how a whole lot of ideas in theory play out in practice. And we've been at the forefront of a lot of cultural movements, a lot of political movements. Just look at what's going on in Gaza there and how suddenly South Africa is part of the story, even though it's not our story at all. It's because we are. We are like one of the few nations that I certainly look to as a futurist, as to being on the edge of executing the future. And there's different parts of the world. I think Canada's one. I think France is always one, quite interestingly. Us and Japan, I generally tend to look to that sort of scattered diaspora of ideas to kind of get sort of a different lenses on sort of previews as to where we headed from a social perspective, from an economic perspective, from a technology perspective, and all the rest of it. So I think it's an interesting place to have grown up. It's also a place that has never been a comfortable place to live. From when we were very small, of course, we were always days or weeks or months away from total disaster or collapse. And that's still the case right now. I mean, we've got an election coming up that's got people panicking. All the white people are selling their houses once again. I am a white person. I can say this because they are. I mean, these are just facts. That's what they do. When white people get scared, they sell their houses and try to run away to Cape Town first. And if they can afford it, then to the UK. And you can always tell the sentiment indicator in terms of South African sort of middle class mentality as to how many for sale signs there are in the gardens. And they had different points of crisis. You've had different waves of that, right? So when COVID was coming, there was like a wave of that where people were trying to run away to an enclave where they could be safe, going to the coast or to Cape Town again. And prior to that, just before the elections that ended apartheid, there was a whole wave there. We don't need to delve too much into the sort of the reasons for why people were scared and what that says about them. But generally, South Africans as a general group are quite good at facing fear, facing chaos, and making a plan. And that's both the advantage and a disadvantage of living in this country, in that we are ridiculously complacent when it comes to our governments and tolerating societal decay and service non-delivery, because we are quite resilient. But resilience can be a curse as well as a blessing. Something that my business partner has been talking about quite a lot this year, this idea of we're tired of being called resilient. We'd like to just actually have a nice normal life for a bit. But that's not the case. That's not it. We are a frontier country, but quite literally speaking, but also in a much more figurative sense as to a bellwether, as to the winds in which the world's waves are blowing at the moment. So in terms of that, the sort of for sale indicators say that yes, we're feeling less optimistic than usual. And if you speak to any South Africans, they're always complaining. They never say they're optimists, but optimism is revealed through practice. And mostly South Africans are quite optimistic, and that you do stick around and families are raised and people do have babies. That's always a great indicator whether communities are optimistic or not. But I would say that optimism has been tested over the sort of waves of chaos and economic and social and political decline throughout living memory. But I've certainly lived through greater pessimism waves of general sentiment and optimism around here. I think that, as always, we've got to sort of follow the actions there. And I think in general, perhaps the sense of a bit less optimism is probably stronger at a global level than it is where I am, quite ironically, as much as people would be confused about that. I think you have to have some global travel perspective to draw those conclusions. And that opinion will be challenged both at home and internationally. But I would counter that, saying how many people have actually experienced both sides of that world to make that criticism.
I think there was a general sense of extreme optimism back in the sort of 50s and 60s when we were coming out of economic depression, the World War, hitting the space race, the atomic age. Everybody could see what the future was what they thought the future was going to look like, which we're all going to be living on the moon. I spoke to another guest.
It was fun.
That's it. Yeah,
it was fun. It was like something to look forward to.
I think that's actually a really good point, is that we had something to look forward to, whereas everybody's mired in the here and now. And we can't actually, I was speaking to another guest earlier, which was, we can't see beyond what we already know. So, which is why the imagination side of things and the science fiction writing all contain the same tropes, which is, AI, sentient spaceships, robots, that kind of thing. It's like, well, this stuff is here. Whereas back in the 50s and the 60s, you could imagine beyond that because you didn't have any sense of what technology could or couldn't do.
Yeah, we got no idea of what comes beyond that. We got no concept of what comes beyond the total. In terms of practical terms, we can already say we've got like a technological singularity. I mean, it's saturated. We have saturated global culture at this point in time. Everyone wears jeans, like the culture is saturated. The technology is saturated. And like right now, the last line of defense is like cognitive privacy. We've given up on privacy in the public domain. Like, oh, the surveillance cameras are here now. That was like the worst thing we could imagine in the 50s and 60s. Now we're like, oh, just another Tuesday. We're like, maybe we should think about maybe cognitive privacy. And like that's what you got to look forward to in terms of the technological feature. That's like, oh, the totalism, it becomes entirely complete. Like, what haven't we saturated yet? Or it's the idea that humans are completely toxic and perhaps we shouldn't have a future. Maybe the future isn't for us. Maybe we should just die like Canada wants us to. Just die now. You've been around enough, humanity. Like, let's just don't. So, which is terrible things to say, but the indicators are all there, especially if you're a young person, right? Like who's offering you anything that you want? There's plenty of people offering you things, and plenty of people offering you things that they would like you to want. But like, who's actually offering you anything that you actually do want for your future? Like, yeah, I get really excited about being single forever because that's so empowering. Like, people are like, I'd actually like to be loved, like maybe, is there something wrong with me? I'd like a hug someday. I don't want to die alone. And the world's like, no, totally, die alone. In fact, we'll pay you to do that. Just like, how is this exciting?
Well, it's not optimistic. Let's put it that way.
No, not at all. But these are the actual messages, because we can talk as much as we like about stories and narratives and all the rest of it. But like, the actions come from that. And it's the actions that we're acting, the stories that we're acting out, that we're playing out on this great role play are not the greatest stories if you want people to be positive. I mean, how do you see a future beyond the singularity? I mean, it's literally the singularity. Or how do you see it beyond extinction, right? Like there's literally nothing there. And any sort of new idea is sort of filtered through that lens first. Like, is this going to contribute to the climate crisis, or is this going to contribute to the technological singularity? Is it going to make the machines nicer to us in the future or not? Like, those are your choices, right? Would you like a benevolent machine god or a not so benevolent one that you can be its slave? But those are your choices. Like, you're getting the machine gods, and we'll be watching you and your brain. Like, it's going to happen. Like.
Do you think optimism breeds agency then? Or does it make agency more, does it make like our agency, or does it make us more complacent because we think, oh, everything's going to be rosy, so I don't need to do anything because it'll take care of itself?
Well, optimism by itself can be paralyzing. Like, this is again the South African issue of, is it effectively like being tolerant of decay is an act of revealed optimism, but it's not productive optimism, right? Productive optimism is backed by action. And this is where agency and optimism go together. Like futurists all know this. The Pollock game is famous for that reason, because you need the optimism and the agency layers together. You have to both believe that things can be better and then have the wherewithal to actually do something about it. I mean, that's the only way things get better. So they have to go in tandem. And there's a very big difference, as I said, between like sort of pragmatic action-based optimism and then just sort of blue sky wannabe optimism, which is also completely useless. I mean, you can believe that things are great when things are really, really bad around you, and that doesn't actually change your situation unless you do something about it. But at the same time, just acting at all towards whatever it is that you want, or your more optimistic scenario, to use sort of futures terminology, by using that little bit of agency to do that, you get more optimism, because now you've got some motion, you've got some momentum. I know this sounds like very sort of motivational speaker-ish, but like, these are the same conversations we have with corporates like all the time, right? Like, they're like, should I invest in something, or is this country going to go to shit? And you're like, oh, well, inevitably it's all going to go to shit. You are going to die. So am I, and so is your business, and so is the planet. But like, what are you going to do about it right now? Would you like to extend the party just a little bit more? And maybe that's the conversation we have to have in the present right now, just about sort of extending that party by a little bit more, because that's kind of believable. And I think that's the other problem with futures optimism at the moment, particularly among younger generations, is that we used to be easier to lie to before we all had access to like, global internet and totalizing media, right? But it's a lot harder to lie to us now, because we can all see what's going on in the rest of the world, right? It's like, whether we admit it or not.
But you don't think that there's a problem in that? There's a problem in that in terms of the amount of misinformation out there as well, that anyone can generate misinformation and therefore carry that, what is it? A lie travels halfway across the world before the truth has its pants on. And that's probably even more prevalent now. The lie has reached Pluto before, before the truth has got out of bed.
Yeah, but then again, that's just because we've deluded ourselves into thinking that we can outsource our belief system, whether that's to another person or to a digital platform or to a news agency. This was a lie we told ourselves, that like mainstream media or news publications were credible and they were the source of truth. They were never the source of truth. They were always biased. They were always written by human beings, but they were the only version of the story that we had. So they were better than nothing. But now the fact that so many more people of even varying degrees of credibility can still put their ideas out into the world and be seen and be listened to, it's forcing us to reevaluate these sort of hearsay fallacies that we've believed in forever. We believe it because we saw it, and we seem to think that something that was printed in a newspaper was more true than something we saw with our own eyes. And we think that a video footage is more true than how we feel or how we see a particular issue. And we're going to have to get around that again as humanity. This idea of even the children that we're raising, saying like the truth is closer to you than it is to anyone else. You're probably just as likely to be able to make a good judgment as to what is real and what is unreal as the next person. We can't defer that outsourcing of judgment to any platform, to any machine. And I almost think that the deep fake thing is actually a good thing in that regard. Like this is like why accelerationists have a point. Like you have to hit rock bottom before you can bounce back sometimes for the impossible to become possible in terms of thinking. And I think that just the fact that really now nothing digital can be taken as truth because it can all be manipulated. It can all be manipulated. There's no such thing as digital evidence, right? Like even if you've got a chain, like in a blockchain, and it's immutable and the whole chain is complete, if the very first rung in that chain is corrupted, all your data is corrupted. Every other layer of information upon that is just building upon a lie. This was like what like Russell and co were talking about back in the day, right? And like this is turtles all the way down thing. So the closest person to the truth really is yourself, and we kind of have to go back to that consensus or popularity doesn't equal validity. It's you that has to make a judgment. You have to decide. And that comes back to that message around agency and how close that is towards optimism. And I'm quite optimistic about that the very fact that there's no way that you can justify digitally manipulated footage in a courts of law, and it's going to become more and more difficult to spot those fakes, means that we have to assume all digitally created content is, inaccurate or is guilty, rather than assuming it is innocent. Because it's not people. You do the opposite with people, right? And with your first person sort of understanding and experience of the world. And I think that could be quite good for us in the long run. We just have to understand that everything we see online or through our VR goggles or whatever, like augmented reality brain chips that we've got, it's all a fiction. It's all a fiction designed to entertain and to sell you, right? So, and if we understand it's fiction, we can enjoy it. So that can be quite fun. So I'm totally pro the weirding of the internet. Like I think that's fun. I think the deepfake technology could be awesome as long as we don't believe it, as long as we understand it's entertainment. Let's be entertained.
So what was some of the entertainment and the unbelievable or the believable futures that you saw as a kid growing up that kind of sort of made you want to think about the future even more, I guess?
Yeah, so I think it's worth noting. I was born the same year that Back to the Future came out, and I think that movie sort of shaped so much of the way I think about the world, and it was so entertaining. It was just a well done, made up movie. But what was great about it is because it contextualized the future according to the past too. That's always what's great about sort of time travel stories, right? That it's all connected, and that everything is there's cause and there's effect, and you change small things, and you can have very big consequences. But it did at least try and think about the future, at least in the sort of Sagan movie and so. And it came up with some rather new ideas that were captivating to a small child like myself stuck in sort of suburban South Africa. And that was entertaining. There were cool things, like all the things that you kind of wanted, the things that you had seen on the cartoons. You had your cool flying cars, you had your sustainability elements, you had all the sort of stuff coming together. But as I mentioned to you before the show, like what we actually got out of that was the self-tying shoes, which no one wanted. No one wants smart toothbrush. No one wants smart shoes. It's just not something, not the exciting parts that we kind of ran with. So Oh, that was quite interesting. And then I also grew up every Sunday afternoon watching Beyond 2000 at my grandmother's house, the Australians. I mean, I probably thought I was Australian, because you kind of sound a little bit the same and they look like us. I thought that would be a pretty awesome job to have, to like go around just like, and there was test driving new vehicles. There was always vehicles on the show, right? It was always about going places. And I think that those are sorts of images about the future that are exciting. So whether it's you're talking about like like monorails that hovered above the tracks in like Japan, which we saw there, for the first time, and they turned into reality, or whether it was rockets going to space, or whether it was cars that were doing interesting things. Like technology and humanity was sort of working together in the sort of visions that we started to see there, right? And I think that's kind of what's missing from our new visions of the future. Like Ivan Illich says, it's almost like us, we were sort of literally slowing ourselves down. Like the Concorde doesn't fly anymore. I remember like there was an episode about that, right? Like, we kind of went back in time rather than forward. Like we slowed ourselves down, we made ourselves smaller. It was interesting to see sort of through the evolution of that show how the balance shifted from the possible to the present, and from what we could be doing to what we shouldn't be doing. And that sort of scold angle of futurism is just so dull. No one wants to be lectured, about how you must do less, move slower, be less, take up less space was the general message sort of by the end of it. And I think that those sort of progressions in the stories people told about the future, I think were really, really interesting. And also at the same time, sort of reading old comic books, the future was exciting, the future was fun, the future was a place where more of our problems would be solved, whereas now the future is a place where they're going to be more, we are making more problems. And there's the truth is to be found somewhere in between those views, but the problems become there are problems when we start to adopt one view or the other, or see them as extremes rather than see it as complexity, and seeing how the mess was always part of the deal. There was no utopia, and that like dystopia is not guaranteed either. It's rather just the fact that we've got to wake up every day and try and do our bit to rage against the dying of the light, right? Just to extend that party a little bit further. That's maybe all we can do, but we should at least be excited to get another dance in, like.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned comics, because and the visions of the future that they projected, because I think it was last week I actually saw Pat Mills, who used to write for 2000 AD, tweet out a picture of the first concepts of Judge Dredd and Mega City 1. And to all intents and purposes, Mega City 1 looked like this kind of sort of Jetsons futuristic city with, high sort of hovering walkways and roads. The cities looked very sort of futuristic and spire-like. And then, of course, what the eventuality that we got, and especially in the movie depiction, was, horrible dystopian mega cities where everybody lived like a slum. And like you say, we went from that kind of optimistic view of the future to dystopian very, very quickly, in a sense, and almost like this is what it's going to look like, please don't build this. But of course you've got that famous meme about the torment nexus, which is, science fiction writes about the torment nexus as a warning to us all, and a Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur looks at it and goes, that's a great thing, I'm going to build it.
Yeah,
and Black Mirror as well.
Everything all predicted. Like, we were like, okay, let's do that. So we're doing it. It's nice now. I mean, my favorite example, just to interrupt you there, is like with the facial recognition instant finding. Like China brought that out with their creepy surveillance program that took place in when was it, like 2017, 2018, it started dripping into the media, but they've obviously been following it for a long time. And everyone was so shocked. All the usual scolds in the future space was like, oh, look at this horrible dystopia. They just walk across the road and the government knows their face and they instantly find them, for jaywalking. And now this year, or towards the end of last year, the UK starts installing, litterbug cameras, but doing exactly the same thing. And all the same people are like, this is great. We love it. We're so excited for the future, but just 3 years ago, this was a nightmare scenario that we were like, we don't ever want to get there. And now we're like, we've done it. We've done it.
It always depends on who has the idea first, though, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah. Who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly.
The Ukraine war. I mean, Ukraine's the good guys, so they can get away with using killer drones. Again, that was something we were like, we don't want to do that. Let's not have those. And then we're like, but the good guys have them. It's cool. Well, now we got killer drones, guys. We got him. Well done. Good job.
Well, we'll have killer robot dogs soon enough because I'm pretty sure I've seen a Boston Dynamics spot with a head-mounted gun or
Yeah,
on it. So
I mean, if it
yeah,
can be done, it will be done.
oh, of course, yeah.
if it can be corrupted, it will be corrupted. That's a general trajectory.
It's funny when you talk about looking back to inform the future, and whether there's a certain amount of nostalgia for things that we have once had, have now progressed beyond, and are now looking back to think, well, actually, there was a better way of doing it, and that was it. Because I don't know if have seen in CES that there is now a phone case for your iPhone or your Android phone that basically has a physical keyboard.
BlackBerry keyboards back.
In BlackBerry, yeah, and it's like, well, we all laughed at the BlackBerry for being so clunky and horrible. And now we're basically another generation or two later, we're demanding it back because we missed that tactile interface again.
Yeah, but nostalgia is also a bit of a trap, right? I mean, if the past is so great, why aren't we still living there? Like there's like especially from a South African perspective, it's very dangerous territory to start saying, "Oh, the past was so great." You're like, "Great for who, guys?" I mean, like in general, and this is of course the catch with when you start looking at history and you start looking at the future and like what is better and what is worse. Is that in general things have got better for more people, like over time. In general, if you were given the wish by the genie that said you can choose what year you're born in, anyway, starting all the way back from whatever BC up until today, but you can't choose where you're going to be born or who you're going to be born to. You just get to pick the year. You'd be pretty mad to pick any year other than this one. Like anytime further back in history, there was more bad luck than good luck, right? But that's not to say that it wasn't better for some people somewhere. And we tend to sort of focus on the exceptional. And particularly, this is a problem with us middle classes, us striving classes, who the few of us who got to grow up in nice middle class homes in the 80s and 90s might hanker after that, not understanding just how much development has taken place in most parts of the world in that time. The other thing that I think that Western middle class people get wrong about nostalgia is that their privileged childhoods were born at the expense of the rest of the world they didn't see. And that's a hard thing to reconcile. So when you're crying in your sort of 30s and 40s and you're like, I still can't afford the house my mom had, but you know what? You're still living a much nicer life than the average person did when you were growing up in your nice 3-bedroom white picket fence house in the 80s with the awful like blue and brown kitchen. Like that's the general reality that we have to have here. That in general, the future has been good for most people, most of the place. And that's where the old sort of cliches come from. Like the future is here, it's just unequally distributed. We have gone through a huge period of distribution. What I'm perhaps more concerned about is that if you look at things in any sort of trend towards progress, it's not guaranteed. They're not guaranteed not to have dips in them in the future. They're not guaranteed not to break entirely. Like there are reasons to think that we could reverse on a whole lot of the actual human flourishing goals that count for most people in real terms, not in nominal terms. Like what gets measured gets manipulated, and that's like a whole side story. But the reason that human progress took place was because we believed it was possible that what we did would get better for us, right? That there was a chance that things could get better. And that's where like Mark Andreessen, as much as the whole world lampooned his essay when he was talking about, hey, I'd like to let's do the thing because, you all like complain too much. He had a point. We do complain too much about what could possibly go wrong. We don't think too much about what could go right. We don't have space for that. And because we don't give space to that, we're kind of slashing all the optimism that we can be passing on to the next generation. If we're saying out the gate, there's nothing we can do that won't have a consequence, therefore we really shouldn't be doing too much. We shouldn't I'm not just doing too much. It's almost the message we're giving to people is we shouldn't be dreaming too much either. And that's very apparent. I mean, like you do a lot of reading, especially on science fiction. I don't know how many new plots you've come across or new ideas, like Mary Shelley when she came up with Frankenstein and when she came up with The Last Man too. These are very old sort of ideas, and we're still mucking around with them now. We still haven't quite achieved Frankenstein, but we're trying goddamn hard with our external wounds and all the rest of it and our biohacking and meat Lego that we're doing at the moment, but we still haven't really executed on those old ones. But I don't see, and it's hard to come up with a brand new idea. How she came up with that is quite incredible because no one had thought about sort of fantasy in that way before, right? And you know about the first vampire story. Where are the new things coming from? I don't know if you've seen much of that, but I see a lot of reworking of older novel ideas. and also a lot of scaremongering about what could be possible. But they don't seem to be a new, like, and my question would be, I suppose another way to put it is that what are the recipes be lying around for sort of next generations Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen to pick up and run with, right? And the thing we have to be aware of is that these sorts of guys will pick up the bad ideas if there are no good ones lying around. And you both pointed that out, right? When you run out of flying cars and, like, journey to the center of Earth sort of screws to try and emulate, well, then you start mucking around with surveillance, right? Like, and then you start mucking around with Orwell's collection of ideas, because hey, there's money to be made here. There's definitely money to be made in this sort of dystopia. We could figure out a way to monetize this, and I think that's a challenge for those of us in the more creative space, in the storytelling space, in the science fiction-y space, to come up with good ideas, because otherwise people are going to execute the bad ones.
Well, that goes back to your point about the singularity, and basically everything, all roads lead to that one point, and nobody can actually see beyond that one point anymore. And an unknown future scares people, so they have to go back to think of, what can I rehash this idea into that makes it feel futuristic, but actually it's been done 100 times before.
Known problems are much safer to
Absolutely, yeah.
rather than unknown problems. And that's not to say all your stories have to have happy endings, not at all. But where are the new cool ideas to play with, to experiment with, to build new franchises on, whatever the sort of case might be. And I'm certainly one to talk. I haven't come up with many myself either, but in general, ideas are built upon each other, as much as the sort of moral panic around plagiarism would have you think that it's all just immaculately conceived from the perfect intellect individual. That's not the case at all. Ideas are built upon, and we're the sort of product of generations of stories that have been built and told about the future. And we sort of act within that. We sort of put these constraints on our own thoughts. But there's another point that I wanted to make that's quite similar to that, talking about, like, the technologists that make the future that we envisage, right? Because they're a separate group, and generally they're not those with huge imagination. These are people with technical ability or with financial ability to execute things. And I think that what you said a bit earlier just reminded me that in general, these technologists are actually quite conservative, not quite radical. As much as we see them as being quite radical entities, they're conservative in that they are building other people's ideas, and that they are building the ideas that they think are the most commercially viable. They're not necessarily building the weird and wonderful things, because that's not their role. Their role is not necessarily to create. Their role is to create fortunes, which is very, very different. And they're useful people, because without them, the future isn't built. But they can also be seen kind of almost as computers that we can program, and we can sort of reprogram them by showing them other things that could make them more successful. It won't necessarily, harm us so much, or will diminish our quality of life so much in pursuit of quantity, right? We need to give them more. We need to distract them. That's what I'm saying. Or we're going to get more Stanley Cups, And
I saw that today, actually. I just couldn't believe it, but yeah.
the best of our generation are changing the color of like a tin mug so that people buy more of them. Yep.
It's nuts, isn't it? That's the depth of where we are right now. So we've got we've got various visions of the future. You got your retrofuturism from the the 50s and 60s. You've got cyberpunk, solar punk. You've got the Cosmo or the Russian future or Soviet futurism as well. And there's Afrofuturism, which is a blend of futuristic ideas and blending in the sort of African culture in that. I mean, have you done any work around that, or what's your thoughts around whether we can draw inspiration from Afrofuturism as well?
Of course we can, but I wouldn't ascribe to myself to that school of thought at all. I mean, I'm not the right demographic for that. It's it's much more of a cultural sort of indigenous thinking kind of an idea. But I think the biggest sort of conversation and the Afrofuturism thing is that there's a lot of conversation in our industry around more indigenous futures, or getting sort of weird Western perspective into thinking about the future, because we can come up with new ideas there rather than the same old ideas. If we're not capable of dreaming up new things, then other groups should do it. And the Afrofuturism one is more de facto interesting, just that Africa is going to be the biggest population continent in the quite foreseeable future there. So that's those sorts of voices should have outsized. We should pay outsized attention to them, simply because they're going to be the dominant majority, and people who have grown up in the African tradition are going to increasingly shape the future of this planet, just by scale and numbers, right? So it does do to pay attention to groups that are ascending in very literal terms, there rather than just groups that are perhaps diminishing in terms of power and influence and population birth rates going forward. In general, though, personally, I'd prefer to see views as being more global or more multifaceted rather than unifaceted when we talk about these things. I think is that we can quite quickly draw ourselves into corners by focusing on certain flavors of futurism rather than see the whole thing, the thing as a whole, right? And I think that's where it becomes more collaborative, but more individually collaborative. And that's where why the 1950s and 1960s sort of futurism felt so fresh, because it was generally one guy's idea, like one illustrator for like a comic book or for a book on the future or for an article. It would like draw their conception. And that's what made it fun, because it was lots of different people, not necessarily people with huge amounts of power or privilege, but people were telling these stories and illustrating them in a way that they understood. And this is why tools like generative AI art could be quite great for futurism if it gets more people who don't necessarily have the physical artistic skills, but to start to speak their visions of what could be possible. When we talk about the future, the other mistake we make quite a lot, particularly with regards to why we're so pessimistic about it, is we frame it in technology only. We don't frame it in more fun ways. In fact, some of the most, if you look back at the real retrofuturism from like those like newspaper columns, I used to ask people what the life would be like in 150, 200 years, whatever in the future, like back in the 1900s, and they would often talk about fashion. They would talk about relationship dynamics. They would talk about what the nuclear family would look like, what sort of pets we'd have. These are much more inclusive conversations, much more exciting than talking about how many more surveillance cameras we can place how much closer to our brains, right? I mean, like, because those are the sorts of things that like technologists think about, because we know how to monetize attention, but we don't think about all the other things that make life much more exciting. And that's why generally, when I think about the future, I try to decenter technology. I think technology is very much a lagging technology and a slow reflection of where the human psyche is at. And I think that there's many more exciting leading indicators in terms of what we're thinking, what we're speaking about. And, like those things make a much richer future tapestry than focusing only on the sort of stuff that we're going to buy and sell and consume.
Is there something that you saw as a prediction that still hasn't come true, or that you wish had come true over and above what did come true instead?
I don't know. That's quite a hard question. It's much easier to answer it the other way around. I mean, like I remember seeing those sort of video clips on features programs for kids talking about the sort of smart homes, and I was like absolutely horrified by that. And hey, we got that right. We get all the stuff all the stuff that we don't want, or things that I always like. Why would anybody want that? And then people are like, we want it. Yes, please, me. I'll take 3. And it's like it's horrible to sort of see those votes like that. But I suppose in terms of features that I was looking forward to that we simply don't have is, I definitely expected to have the ability to get more places quicker and faster. And I think that it's a huge tragedy that travel is still so elitist, that it is so slow, that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Concorde doesn't fly anymore. I mean, I was looking forward to flying on the Concorde, don't have that. Maybe we're talking about getting new ones, but we've been talking about them since we decommissioned the last one. When was it? In like the 80s, right?
Yeah.
The sense that the world actually got smaller rather than got bigger, right? And I think that's quite sad. I mean, I thought about simple things that I thought that I would be able to ride on a train from Cape Town to Cairo. No, guys, we can't even lay like a rail across Namibia. We haven't. I was quite disappointed about how hard it was to get around my own planet, and I suppose that disappointment continues into the conversations we see now about wealthy people, often in our industry even, complaining about how the business lounges at airports are full of the middle classes now. They should really because it's ruining the experience.
Well, Bronwyn, this has been great being able to chat to you about this stuff. And I fully agree in terms of not being able to travel. Especially in my sort of corner of the world where, you're in South Africa.
We're very
it takes
far
me
away
12. Yeah, I know. It takes me 12 hours to get to you. Straight line all the way down, right enough. But it's from Edinburgh, I can't even get a direct flight.
Yeah.
And we certainly, it takes me 4.5 to get to London, but and that's by train. But certainly the connections in terms of travel and modes of travel haven't really improved since since I was a child, really. And we all hear about the HS2 and what a debacle that has been in the UK as a paragon of, not virtue, but a great example of what not to do, I guess, and where to siphon some money off at the same time. But this has been a great conversation. Thank you very much for taking your time. Where can people find out more about you and engage with you about what you do?
Yeah, sure. My business is Flux Trends. That's Flux, like as in the world in flux, fluxtrends.com. You can see what we're up to there. Otherwise, I'm on most of the social platforms, unfortunately. We have to shout above the noise. Quite easy to find. Most of my handles or ways to find me are just my name, Bronwyn Williams. But yeah, so that's what we do. We talk about the future. And hopefully complain in a slightly different way. It makes you think slightly differently. It's the way what other people are complaining about.
Complaining with a purpose. There we go.
Yeah, complaining with a purpose. Raging, ranting at the sky. Shout at the clouds.
Bronwyn, again, thanks for being as a guest. We will talk to another guest in the future on this podcast, The Days of Futures Past, where we will cover more retrofuturism, visions of the future that did and didn't come true, and what we can do about it. Where you can find Bronwyn will be in the show notes with all URLs, etc., for you to click. See you again soon. Bye.
This is Days of Futures Past, signing off, when we'll once again peel back the curtain on more lost futures. Stay tuned, and remember, the future may be here, but the past never fades. Until next time. Days of Futures Past was brought to you by Theo Priestley, keynote speaker, author, and retrofuturist. If you'd like to appear as a guest and reminisce about futures gone by, get in touch. I've been your radio host, Andrew Helbig. Goodbye for now.